Everyone, I'm Aqsa Taylor, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Abstract Security. Joining me here today is Greg Olmstead, who has a lot of experience with data and especially organizations that work with data operations, architecting and implementing data strategy, and is a contributor to our upcoming book on how to design a successful data strategy. And over to you, Greg. Why don't I give you this time to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Greg Olmstead. I've been a software engineer and cloud architect for about the last 18 years. I started off in the energy industry in Canada, working on document management systems. I learned C# on the job, didn't go into it with any programming experience, and then moved into the financial services field in capital markets, working on trading systems, different kinds of UI frameworks, that sort of thing. I moved on from there to the technology industry in media and financial services technology, and started working in the cloud and really never looked back. The cloud was very much where I decided I was going to want to spend a lot of my time. Throughout all of this, I started building up my security expertise. I re-met Justin Borland back in 2007. We had been friends since the seventh grade, but we hadn't seen each other for a while. And we randomly ran into each other in 2007
Oh,
working for the same energy industry company in Canada, and decided that we were going to start a business together, doing at the time small business setups and sort of side jobs to make some extra money. We quickly sort of turned that into developing our own projects in the security space and malware analysis to begin with, and sort of certificate of transparency analysis after that. Around that time, towards the end of all of that, I moved down to New York City to work as a principal engineer in the finance and media tech space. And now I think you have me in as I work for Bloomberg as a cloud security architect. So that's sort of been my journey.
wow, that's an amazing journey. Many different industries. You touched kind of like everything, getting without programming, getting into cybersecurity, and then like making your way all the way here. What are some trends? I mean, as a part of Bloomberg, what are some trends you see with organizations when it comes to how they handle data or maybe even the challenges they have with data operations?
I think that organizations can sometimes have a hard time understanding that the way that they start with data is not going to be the way that they finish, if that makes sense. The thing that we see a lot is that organizations let's stay with startups, will start working with data at a much lower order of magnitude and have an operational model around that makes sense at the time. But that over the normal course of business will quickly spiral into something completely different. And it is very difficult for an organization to transition towards a different operating model than the one that they are currently working on while they're working on it. I liken it to laying the train tracks while the train is steaming along. It's really, really hard to do because you can't simply take all of your people and put them on building a new platform while your old platform continues to chug along and requires lots of KTLO and maintenance and manual intervention. And you couple that with a lot of the time when you're in the startup mode or SMB mode, not fully automating your data operations stack. And so you have all these manual things that generally work fine when you're, in that small scale, but quickly become insurmountable when you get to a larger scale. And then when you want to allocate people to building that new world of data operations, not only can you not completely walk away from your old one, you actually don't have any additional cycles to devote to your new one because you were at full capacity with all of the manual intervention stuff that you did. I have come across this in every single place that I've worked. And I never worked for any of these places when they were startups. I'm even talking about when you go from big organization to bigger organization. This problem tends to happen over and over again. You don't always have the lessons being learned, or the lessons may not look the same. So that's one of the big trends that I see is like we built a system, the system worked great while it was working great. Now we need to move to a new system and we don't have the ability or the bandwidth to do so.
So it's not just being locked in a tool or a platform, it's being locked in a strategy, like
Correct.
not being able to decouple from it after you have volumes of data. Do you think organizations don't revise their strategy as often as they should, maybe, even if it's working fine, just to like future-proof their strategy? Or is it like a reaction to an action? Like, oh, now we have a lot of data. Now we go back and see how we were doing things.
I don't necessarily lay this at the feet of the organization because it's really hard to know where your company is going in the next 5 or 10 years, especially if you're new. And a lot of the time, the focus for a new company is getting to market as soon as possible. And that generally will mean that you are making decisions that prioritize speed to market over scalability, adaptability, maintainability, and other non-functional requirements that will become far more important later on, especially as you move towards a desire towards acquisition. A lot of the time, these companies that are acquiring you would like to see that you have your ducks in a row and that they are not just simply buying a giant rat's nest that they're going to have to throw out and rebuild anyway. So, but the problem is like you don't know what you don't know at that time. And when usually these things don't become obvious to you until you start realizing that you are painting yourself into a corner from a bandwidth perspective. And I mean a human bandwidth perspective. I don't necessarily mean a network bandwidth perspective. And you start realizing that you can't just throw money at the problem anymore. You like there is a diminishing returns curve of throwing money at problems where you run out of room and you realize there is not enough disk space or network throughput or even human interaction in the world that is going to resolve this problem. And now we have to re-architect to operate at the scale that we need to operate at. And that means a significant undertaking, a total rethink about how we treat our data. Not, it means not just data, it's everything, but like for the purposes of our discussion, data.
Right.
And then how do we migrate to that new system? How do we do it without any downtime or minimal downtime? How do we ensure that we don't lose anything in the process, et cetera? And then that tends to happen more than once, generally speaking.
Right. How does Let's switch gears to security a little bit. How does governance play a role in all this? Like, especially with changes or having to re-architect. How much supervision do security teams have with the IT teams, telemetry, data tracking, and all of that? How does governance play a role in all of this? Do you think companies are mature or they're figuring things out, or it's a collaboration, or there's struggle?
So I think that governance will never be paid attention to as much as it should because it is not fun. It's kind of a weird thing to say, but it is one of those things that a lot of companies approach with just being like, okay, we need a strategy, we need something.
Mhm.
Let's tick this box. But they don't really think really, really critically about like, how do we approach governance? How do we make sure that it scales with our data? How do we make sure that it aligns with our business goals and that it continues to align with our business goals? And like, how do we continue to make sure that is the case? Because it may start that way, but then our business changes and our governance may not change with it.
Mhm.
And how do we actually verify and audit and enforce our governance practices? Because you can write lots of flowery documents about data governance and other kinds of governance, but if you can't measure it, then you can't verify it. And this has been a mantra that I tend to put in a lot of my talks. Um, the biggest thing that I see is while companies think that they have a good idea of their governance, their data governance, they really don't. And the better ones understand that they understand that they actually have a problem that is undefined and that they don't know like how bad things are, and their goal is to try and wrap their arms around it. And the less prepared ones think, well, I'm sure that there are some stuff around the edges of this program, but in general, we're probably in pretty good shape. They may have governance controls that show them on a dashboard that like things are in some okay state, but in reality, they are just don't have cameras everywhere, if that makes sense,
Right,
right?
right.
Um, data governance is one of the most difficult to measure things that I think exists in the industry because especially on premises, like in the cloud, things are a little bit easier because there are fewer ways that data can manifest itself. Like
Mhm.
on premises, I could literally have
Yeah.
a hard disk sitting in a desk drawer somewhere. And that is That is data at rest. Like it is no different than data in a database.
Hmm.
And, you know, people do crazy things. People go and open up their desktops and pull hard drives out and swap it with something that they bought off of Best Buy. Like the human element is so difficult to predict. So on-prem data governance is almost an unsolvable problem. And the best thing that you can do is establish very good policies, put as many good guardrails into effect as you can, have a very robust educational program around it, really try and make the humans in the organization part of the security apparatus. But at the end of the day, you simply will have to resign yourself to the fact that you'll never be perfect. In the
Hmm.
cloud, I think, and my expertise most recently and generally speaking lately has been in the cloud. You still are never going to be perfect, but you have a much better chance of getting further than you do on premises. There's only so many places that data can live
Right,
in cloud services. And while it's really hard to wrap your arms around all of them, every cloud service provider has managed services that help you at least get close.
right,
Um, Couple that with the fact that generally speaking, the inflow and outflow of data goes through predictable interfaces. You can't just unhook a hard disk and have it locked away in a drawer somewhere. You will see that in a report of your Elastic Block Store volumes. You have a better chance of writing a simpler and more achievable governance program. So that's where I see this is a very long tangential answer to your question. I apologize. I think
oh, it's good.
the short answer is that I think organizations are waking up to the fact that they need to do more from a data governance perspective. I
Right,
think that the level of maturity that we see in the industry is still catching up to that realization.
right. And does the size of the organization matter or not really? Because a small company can have a lot of data and a big company can have a lot of policies and processes in place but still be outdated. What is your experience?
I think that most of my work has been with large organizations, so that's my primary experience. But from what I have seen in the industry through my peers and through conferences and all that kind of stuff, is that like the bigger organizations tend to have the kind of security apparatus that will involve things like data governance and risk organizations. Like if you have a CRO group, Chief Risk Office, you are much more likely to have some kind of data governance in place.
Mhm.
Smaller companies, especially startups, have to prioritize the resources and they will tend to not prioritize data governance unless data is their lifeblood and they're dealing with things like PHI, then obviously everything that I'm saying goes out the window. But most companies deal with, or at least think that they are dealing with, less severe data. Now, in reality, I mean, almost every company is processing PII of some sort, and so they should be following these practices. But if you don't know, if you're not an expert in data governance or data management, you may fool yourself into thinking that you are in a different category than you are. And so you end up saying, well, our most important things are data security, which is absolutely true. We need to make sure we're encrypting and doing access control and doing all the things to keep data safe. But you may not pay as much attention to data governance, i.e., who should have access to the data, where should it be allowed to live, how long should it be allowed to live there. These are just higher order questions. I tend to represent maturity models with pyramid, like Maslow's hierarchy, and data governance, broadly speaking, is somewhere towards the middle of that pyramid, maybe even further up. I find that a lot of organizations, until they get large enough to engage a risk group within them, tend to stay on the food, water, and shelter level of the pyramid, which is just like, do we at least have a password required to access this data? Is it encrypted at rest? Are we sending it in plain text for the internet? That sort of thing, right?
Like basic compliance checks and standard.
Right. Yeah. Even compliance is another thing where we're still that's a risk function, right? And like until you are at the level of maturity where you can actually start thinking about risk beyond just, or am I getting hacked right now? Is somebody actively siphoning my data out of my S3 buckets?
Mhm.
You tend not to think from a compliance and governance perspective, and you think more from a operational, like I said, like is something happening right now? How do I stop somebody from breaking in today?
Mm.
Perspective.
And I come from a CNAP background myself, just working with container security solution, Twizzlog, and then the application protection platform. And there's so many, layers to it. There's identity, there's data, there's workloads or applications, posture management, and all. So, as the vendors or t technologies are moving towards platformization, do you see that maybe with the latest, push towards security and so many more vendors being available in the space and different parts of it, like observability platforms, the analytics platforms, SOC operations, so many tools, has it been a benefit for companies now that, oh, there is something already available that I can use? Or has it become like a cluster? Like, oh, now I have 10 tools and I don't know which one's showing me visibility where. And I'm getting alert fatigue with all these platforms.
It's a really good question. The best way that I can answer that is from the cloud perspective, because again, like my most recent experience, I think that the availability of these tools in the industry is a net benefit. Like, I don't think anybody can really argue that. Like, there has been a significant leveling up of many organizations' maturity that would not have been possible if these vendors didn't exist. We've just done some deals with some vendors in the industry in my organization where if we didn't do those deals, we simply would not have these capabilities, or we would spend the next 5 years developing them and they would be like 10% as good, right? The thing that I would say is the only, not the only, but one of the biggest downsides to them is this sort of false sense of security that like, okay, I've onboarded this tool, I've added all my accounts to it, all of my buckets are sort of showing up in the tool, therefore I am safe. Everything is fine, right? But nobody is actually, they see the big green check mark in the tool and they think, great, everything is great. But they don't really understand what the check mark means and what methodology is being used to evaluate whether the data store or whatever it is you're looking at is compliant. What rules is it compliant with? Like they'll just leave the default rules on and be like, oh, whatever came out of the box must be fine.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that a lot of that is true, but if you don't, again, if you can't measure it, you can't verify it. And like you are just relying on somebody else to tell you that everything is fine instead of, that feeling you have inside that everything's fine. I think that when people bring these tools on and integrate them into their corporate processes, if they have them, of course, because like I said, startups will not have these processes in place, and really make an effort to understand what the tool is telling them, to maintain the tool's integration with their systems and actually verify that those integrations are still healthy. Because I can't tell you how many times I've seen a tool and it's like, yeah, everything's good. And then you look under the hood and the tool hasn't actually had an update to its underlying data in 6 months. And so all the check marks are 6 months old. Then you can actually start to have some confidence that like, hey, we're not just looking at a dashboard and getting a check mark. We understand what these check marks mean. We have automated validation of them, et cetera, right? Again, a level of maturity of integration of tools and corporate processes that I think many organizations are still working on getting there with.
Right. And talking about check marks and not understanding or kind of having like a black box of, oh, something goes in, a report comes out, and I'm going to present this report to higher ups management. If you were, what role do you think, or how is the management involved? Let's say on the CISO level, they're not really sitting in front of, watching platforms and tools. They're looking at summarized reports. They're looking at higher level, how are we doing? How is our governance program? How compliant are we? Did we get these SOC 2 type 2 approval or did we go through the FedRAMPs, whatever, just kind of like getting into certifications, audits and all. How mature do you see working with these large organizations that the knowledge that CISOs have about what's really going on versus like being at the higher managerial level? So like, is there technical backing up, or is it like, hey, if you want a report, let me go back to my, teams, tell them to pull some dashboard and what has been your experience in that?
Yeah, and I mean, all of the stuff I'm talking about today doesn't like it is not specific to the organization that I work at now or the organizations
Or
that I've worked at in
yeah,
the past. Like this is generally broadly my observations about the industry through peers and stuff like that, and obviously some borrowed from my own personal experience. I think that generally speaking, the CISO, just like any other C-level function, is an executive function. It's not really meant to be somebody who is trying to parse information. It is somebody who is trying to look at information and make decisions and in as educated but also efficient manner as possible in order to benefit the organization. The CISO in particular has a extremely critical function because of the legal responsibility that they have. They are personally in some cases liable for the decisions that they make. And so they really have to trust some of the information that is coming up to them. At the same time, though, there is so much information coming up to them from so many different parts of their organization, in particular large organizations, that they simply can't pull every thread. They can barely pull any of the threads. They have to trust the information being summarized and disseminated to them by their practitioners. So I think it is difficult to expect people in that role to be in touch with the lowest level information that exists in their organization. I think they will be plugged into some things like their critical security, or obviously if they have a breach, they will definitely be very involved in the response and processing of the information of that breach. But in general, I mean, if we're implementing new governance rules or something like that, they will be likely briefed and will likely have some input into that process, but certainly will not be heavily involved. I think if a smaller organization, startup level, has a CISO, of course, they are probably going to be much more directly involved. Maybe they are actually doing it themselves. So it's a sliding scale from small to large organization and how plugged in they are to this kind of thing.
and talking about liability, I mean, the governments of, I mean, different geographies, not just US, but across UK and all the other, countries, they're taking a more active role as well because how important, how critical data has become. Everything is virtual now, like your identity, your assets, everything you do, your locations, like personal PII, but at a much larger scale than having paper records from years ago. So let's talk about US. I mean, with the SEC mandates and how it has impacted in the past, we've seen very popular cases of CISOs being personally liable and held responsible for the disclosure or non-disclosure of incidents, and the famous 4-day rule of report. Um, how what are your thoughts on some of that, like in terms of like the liability that CISOs personally have and how they're supported by the organization to make sure that they they stand ground on it? Do they have enough maturity in the organization to support that kind of a process model where as soon as something is discovered as material incident, they have a process triggered, or is it like case by case basis? Like people are still struggling to figure out, okay, what is material, what is not, and how quickly can we get this report out, this communication out? What are your thoughts on it?
So, in terms of my thoughts on whether it's a good thing or not, I think it is because the level of motivation that you need to give people in order to admit to something that may cast them in a bad light is pretty big, right? I mean, nobody wants to admit that their organization suffered a breach. It's certainly bad for business, and it certainly doesn't engender a lot of trust in them by the community at large. But it has to be done because their customers have a right to know, their partners have a right to know, their clients, their dependents. I think that the level at which the regulations are and how really significant challenge to most organizations because while we've seen that regulations take a really long time to come into effect and be written and be enforced, it takes even more time for organizations to pivot and adopt and comply with those regulations. It's really, really hard for an organization of tens of thousands of people to suddenly turn around and adopt a new data regulation that requires them to have some kind of control in place that they never had before because they may not have the apparatus to actually implement that control, and they have to invent that apparatus and deploy it to their entire organization just for the compliance with this one regulation. And that happens a lot. So, and it happens in the finance industry. It gets really hard for the finance industry to pivot to these new regulations, and you tend to see the regulatory projects being some of the biggest ones that get undertaken in a given year or multi-year. So while I think it's absolutely critical, I'm absolutely pro-regulation because, to be honest, we are humans, and the only way that you get us to do things that are not necessarily from a profit-driven motive is to force us to do it. And the only people that can force us to do it is the government. So, take that any way that you like, but I don't think there's too many people that would disagree that is really the only way to get people to do things that are not directly benefiting their bottom line. Especially in countries where that is the primary motivator. So it is absolutely necessary. The question of how do we do that effectively and in partnership with industry, I think the governments are doing their best to try and meet the industry where it lives and give them the tools that they need to do the job, while also not giving them a 10 miles of rope. There is always going to be some interplay between government and industry. One will complain that the government is being too heavy-handed, and the government will complain that industry is not meeting their regulatory responsibilities fast enough. At the end of the day, what actually happens is a partnership, and regulators and CISOs tend to work together to try and make sure that we are at least making progress. We have a plan. That plan is being faithfully executed, and what really matters is good faith. Now, I am not a regulatory guy. I don't work in the regulatory organization, so I could be completely being sold a web of lies here. But that is my observation. Like, generally speaking, my observation is that while there may be external displays of displeasure with this sort of thing, what really happens in the organization and between them and government is a partnership and working towards the goals.
Absolutely. I think that's excellent points to be taken here. Thank you, Greg. I'd like to shift gear a little bit and talk about the book now, because from I mean, everything that you've said from the beginning, like, changing or re-architecting data strategy, how it's like one of the bigger bottlenecks, and then, having a dashboard of things, but not really understanding how things are done. So you don't have the right metrics, or you may not understand what metrics to gather to measure your governance. And that applies broadly, not just governance, but your entire efficiency of your data strategy program. So tell me about your personal inspiration behind contributing to this book for how organizations can help achieve a better data strategy.
I think that there are a lot of books out there that talk about how to secure your network, how to deploy a landing zone, how to do these technical things. And there's lots of books out there for CISOs about how to do a security strategy, how to run a governance program, and that kind of thing. There is not that much good information about how do I, as a new company, a new organization, create a data strategy and scale it as I scale my company, right? You have a lot of things that are targeted at small businesses. I have a lot of things that are targeted at large enterprises. What I haven't seen a ton of is like, what are the things that we can learn and execute on from both of those angles that are common, that allow us to build a strategy that serves us both in our infancy and in the enterprise case. So one of the things I wanted to do for contributing to this book, for one thing, is to provide the clouding because that's where a lot of my experience is, but to try and draw parallels between it and the on-premises case and try and explain how cloud is different and why where it fits, right? And how to fit that into a data strategy without sort of totally reinventing the wheel. But yeah, those are sort of the two approaches that I had with this. Was like, let's write a book that is holistic and makes sense at all scales. That isn't sort of pigeonholing itself into something where we have petabytes or we only have gigabytes of data, and something where we can start to talk about like, hey, we understand that most organizations now have a hybrid on-prem and cloud architecture, tend to be multi-cloud, that sort of thing. How do we factor that into our data strategies?
Absolutely. And during these meetings that we had, brainstorming about the book structure and ideas, you shared a lot of personal stories as well. So for the viewers of this video, are there any lessons learned from data battlegrounds that you can share? Maybe your top three or even one.
So that's an interesting question. I think that one of the and I mean I can't really talk too much about specifics because like that would give
Yeah,
away
of
a little
course.
bit too much than I will give away about my previous organizations. But like one of the big ones that I tend to see a lot, we talked about earlier, is once we start working with the cloud, we start realizing that we have no idea what we have where from a data perspective. We
Visibility.
may have a data governance process on premises, but people for some reason don't think that applies to the cloud and start to just sort of do whatever they want. We may have very strict tooling and approval processes for moving data from one data store to another on premises, but the cloud may have represented a way to circumvent those processes by using Amazon S3, for example, to move data up and then back down again instead of going across a network boundary, things like that. I have seen that multiple times in my various organizations and peers that I've worked with. It's really important to understand that the moment that you give access to a cloud environment to anybody, that if you don't have a full and comprehensive set of guardrails around that cloud environment, you are immediately going to start seeing non-compliance with your existing processes. And a lot of organizations start with the cloud as a skunkworks project. Like they think, oh, we don't have enough machines in our data center to run this project. Let's buy a cloud account and spin up a cloud account and run it in the cloud. And so that's their first touch of the cloud. And so it doesn't come from a central place. We don't have a cloud center of excellence. Our risk organization may not even know that we're doing this. And then another person in another department hears about it, and now they would like also to have a cloud account, and then another department hears about it, and so on, and it snowballs. And by the time the security apparatus of the organization finds out about what's going on, we have 100 cloud accounts and 16,000 virtual machines or something like that. Like I'm just pulling these numbers out of thin air, but and now we have data all over the place, and we have no idea what it is it secured, who has access to it, how many times has it been viewed, is it publicly accessible, and if it is publicly accessible, who has pulled it down from the internet, and so on. And then it is a giant cleanup effort, and that cleanup effort can take 10 times as long as it took to create the problem in the first place. So that is one data battleground that I have seen a lot of.
Mm,
And that really ties back to your first set of questions around governance, right?
right.
Um, I'd say that that's the biggest one that I wanted to talk about in the book was just like how to control the problem before it becomes a problem. Other ones tend to be along the lines of designing data management pipelines that are too small, storage mechanisms that are too slow, those kinds of things, and then having to figure out how to migrate from them. These all kind of just tie back to the questions you've already asked, so I apologize if it's a bit boring, but like really just trying to figure out how to move over to that new system while keeping the old system operational and functional and not losing track of your manual processes. That is such a common problem because like manual processes tend to worm their way into automation over time as the automation begins to get more and more brittle and more rusted. You tend to see like, oh, our automation can't handle this edge case, and so we will just insert somebody to click a button at this point in the pipeline to send it this way or that way until we figure out how to automate that button. And then that button just never gets automated, right? And then more buttons get in and more buttons get in. And all of a sudden, you have somebody whose full-time job it is to be a button clicker.
Yeah.
So that's a really big one because again, just like with the cleanup of the data spray, it takes a much longer time to unwind the manual processes that have wormed their way into your automation than they do to appear in the first place. And it is often very hard to sell that to the finance groups and the product owners and the people that are responsible for deciding what goes into your backlog as like, well, hey, the last thing any product owner wants to hear is the words tech debt, right? Especially if it is tech debt that has appeared where there was previously no tech debt. Like it is somewhat understandable to deal with tech debt when it is from a new product that has been built. It is far less understandable to deal with tech debt that came from a previously automated system.
Yeah.
So that's another one for sure.
Now,
Uh, I guess the third one would be when you build a data system that is not flexible enough to deal with changing regulatory landscapes,
mm,
you really paint yourself into a corner. I have seen this in industry where a new regulation will be put in place, and it's literally just like we're recapping all the same questions we just talked about. I'm so sorry, but
oh, good.
you're just a very good question asker because they're all very relevant questions. Where the regulation will come into place, and the organization will realize, oh, we designed this data pipeline in such a way that we have to almost rebuild it to comply with this regulation. And if we had made some decisions differently, maybe with the view to, hey, this is likely something that is going to come up in a future regulatory change because, well, it affects people in a certain way or deals with people's private information, whatever. These are often things that can be at least a little bit foreseeable, then we would have had a far easier time of this. And so now we have a 1.5 year long project where it may have only been a 6 month long project to comply with this regulation. And that often then also comes with a massive ETL project because once you fix the pipeline, you also now have to go back and fix the data. So that's another big one. I think those are my big three.
Yeah, so if I were to put it in like a bullet point, it would be visibility, data visibility, and data governance or automating data governance instead of relying on a lot of tech debt or manual operations. And I think the third one is having a flexible, when you construct or architect a system, making it flexible. So you're
Yes.
not going back again to being locked in, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So be the
The
top.
second one we tend to call like heroics, right? Like we see like this process only works because person X uh, performs heroics on a daily basis. And if we lost that person, we would lose really critical knowledge to how this process actually functions, and we wouldn't be able to just simply continue business. It happens more often than you might think.
Oh yeah.
Uh, and a lack of a very, very consistent lack of documentation in I mean almost every organization on the planet. Let's be honest, with the exception maybe of Amazon because they have an amazing documentation standard. It compounds the problem because now you don't even have a source of truth to go back and look at and be like, okay, well, this person has unexpectedly left the company, but I can at least go back and retrace their actions and try and figure out what to do. That often just simply doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So
Kind of.
I'm sure we've all been down this battleground where somebody leaves and everything gets thrown into complete turmoil. And then sometimes that increases the attrition rate and more people leave. So having those processes well documented and having those documents be frequently maintained and generally having somebody whose job it is to maintain those documents is super critical to continue a continuity of business.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Greg. Now, we're coming towards the end of this episode, so any last thoughts for the readers of the book and the people watching this video? Or I mean, you already kind of answered like why we needed this book and why you personally contributed to it. But anything that you want to share that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Sure. So the biggest thing that I want the viewers of this video to take away from this is plan ahead. You may be starting a new company. Starting new SaaS companies is at an all-time high and probably going to continue to rise. Almost all, if not all, of those SaaS companies have to deal with data. And they will start off dealing with a little bit of it, and they will end up, hopefully, if they're successful, dealing with a lot of it. And if you don't think holistically and a long way down the road, how am I going to deal with all of this data? Not just processing all this data, not just like, do I have enough hard disks and do I have enough network throughput, but do I have a really good understanding of where it's coming from, where it's going, who owns it, who should have access to it? I know it's not fun. It's certainly not a sexy thing to think about, but like it is something that will save you at least a lot of money and at most somebody going to jail way down the line, right? It is something that I think very few organizations that start small and get large do a really good job of keeping up with. So don't let that be you. Have a plan, revisit your plan at least every year, if not every 6 months, and make sure that you are scaling your strategy whether it is for governance or compliance at the same rate as you're scaling your actual data, and know what your next steps are going to be. If you start to see that your architecture for data, whether it's governance or actual processing or whatever, is starting to not be adequate, don't wait until it falls over. Like make a plan early for how to evolve your strategy, because it will seem like you have a lot of time to change what you're doing and to change strategy. But in reality, that will quickly catch up with you, and you will end up in a situation where you may start losing business. You may start actually dropping the ball. Things may get away from you, and you paint yourself into a really nasty corner. Finally, I would say have a really good understanding of the technology that you're working with when it comes to data. There are a lot of very effective managed services in the cloud environment that help you manage your data efficiently and scale with you, both in a cost and performance sense. And the security practices that you can implement in the cloud will get you to a level of maturity much faster than you would be able to get to that same level of maturity on premises. Take advantage of that. Being able to control access and encryption and lifecycle management and all of those things in the cloud is so much easier, maybe a little bit more expensive, but is so much easier and faster that you may want to consider going cloud native because of not just that reason, but among that as one of the reasons. Part of why I like the cloud so much is just the ability to leverage so much expertise of the people that built that cloud platform in the first place to enable me to focus on my business practices while being reasonably assured that the governance and compliance and security processes that I've put in place are well implemented. Now, those are, I think, the three big things that I'd like people to take from this.
Thank you so much, Greg. And more of these thoughts are going to be compiled in the ebook. So I really hope you enjoy reading it as much as we've enjoyed contributing to it and writing it. And thank you, Greg, for your time with me today in sharing all of your thoughts and opinions. We really appreciate it. And just a disclaimer again for our viewers and audience, this is just Greg's experience and opinions and thoughts, not a representative of any organization that he's a part of or I'm a part of. This is just for community knowledge and awareness as we share about the best strategies and best practices when it comes to data strategy. Thank you, and thanks for watching.
Thanks a lot, Aqsa.